Hello, my name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. I have a question for you today. Has the BC NDP been collaborating with far-left environmental activists to upend property rights, mineral titles, and commerce and the economy as we know it in BC today? Yes. Yes, they have. And I would like to back that up today with an explanation of what I'm talking about. I'm going to delve into an analysis of the court case that everyone is talking about, the appeals court decision that decided that DRIPA, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, is enforceable across all British Columbia laws. I think what we're going to find, what I would like to explain today, is a deeper analysis of this case reveals that the BC government has, to some extent, been gaming the public, and the media has played along with that. So let's talk about that. The initial court case had to do with the mining industry. It was called Gitxaala versus British Columbia, the Gold Commissioner, and that case was originally brought in October of 2021, and it had kind of two tracks to it. One was there was a declaration sought to that the location of a mineral claim in BC required First Nations consultation in advance, a radical change that threatens to upend the entire industry. The second track was to seek a declaration that DRIPA was enforceable in BC law. So what happened was that the government lost the case on the mineral claims, but surprisingly, the judge ruled that DRIPA was not enforceable. It was just merely a set of guidelines, if you will. And then the First Nation appealed that decision, and the appeals court agreed with them. And so we're in a state now where this broad set of guidelines that came down from the United Nations is supposedly going to reshape every possible law in British Columbia. So how did we get here? What was the nature of this case in the first place? Well, I think the public has been somewhat misled in the framing of the case in the first place, and I'm going to delve into that somewhat. So there is somewhat of a misconception that would say that, well, this First Nation on the north coast of British Columbia woke up one day and decided, well, I want to attack the BC mining law to be consulted on every mineral claim that's ever going to be staked in my territory. That's not what happened. And here's what I am going to suggest happened. Environmentally activist lawyers have been attempting for decades to gut mining laws, not only in BC, but also in the United States and other jurisdictions around the world. They have been unsuccessful. So as a tactic, they went out and they found a First Nation and a set of circumstances that would advantage their case. And they found a very appropriate opponent in court, a government led by an activist lawyer. So what do I mean by activist lawyers? Well, the people representing the Gitxaala in court were members of what it's called West Coast Environmental Law. It's not just a regular law firm. It's a charity that is supported more than 50%, or not more than, but about 50% by outside Canada funding, including Tides based in California, the Tides Foundation. So, to give you a flavor of why I believe this, I'm holding in my hands here, this is the cover page of a report written by West Coast Environmental Law entitled Modernizing BC's Free Entry Mining Laws for a Vibrant, Sustainable Mining Sector. Here's the thing. This report was written in 2013, 8 years before the Gitxaala case. And it's like a 40-page report. And the report is not simply appealing to First Nations, they're reaching out to any stakeholder who will get on board with them. They're talking to farmers, ranchers, anyone who might be upset if a mineral claim was staked on their property. And perhaps I could just pause for a second and explain what a mineral claim really is. A mineral claim does not give the holder any surface rights. The whole point of the Mines Act that was originally put in place in 1859 as a result of the Fraser River Gold Rush. I'm standing right beside the Fraser River here. You can imagine during the rush there would have been tens of thousands of Americans flooding into the Fraser River to seek their fortune in gold. So the laws were set up not to give miners undue advantage in extracting gold from the riverbank. It was to set up an orderly way in which the mining activity could take place and for a way for the government to have control over people just running around the countryside willy-nilly. And it was also put in place by Governor James Douglas at the time to protect Indigenous interests. And there's an excellent book that I would highly recommend. It's called Claiming the Land by his BC historian Daniel Marshall. But that's a bit of a side issue. He talks about how it's a very detailed review of the Fraser River Gold Rush. So here we have an activist law firm seeking to destabilize. They've been working on this plan. The objective of undermining mining laws is like a wedge issue into all other property rights and in a way to reshape and reform the entirety of the economy, and as I will argue, society itself. Well, that seems pretty far-fetched. Is it? No, it's not far-fetched, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, the surprising thing about the case is that the BC government, although it lost on the mineral claim issue, neglected to appeal. Well, why wouldn't they appeal this decision? Well, I put that question to government officials in 2023 at a mining conference, and the explanation was, well, the decision really kind of aligned with our values and aligned with what we thought DRIPA really should be all about, that we should really be... So in other words, we have activist lawyers in court with other activist lawyers, with an activist government. They're really fighting themselves. So it's no surprise. So it was the First Nation that brought the appeal because the judge surprisingly made a ruling that, well, DRIP is not even enforceable in BC laws. So they went back to court and they prevailed. So what I would like to delve into a little further is the lower court's decision. So the lower court You know, they dealt with the DRIPA issue and they dealt with the mineral claims issue. And we have to understand that activists do not, in my opinion, have the best interests of Indigenous people in mind. What they have in mind is their objectives. What are their objectives? Their objectives are to keep minerals in the ground, to keep fossil fuels in the ground, to kill all fossil fuel infrastructure, to paint people as climate criminals, to preach a climate Armageddon and a climate emergency, and that any and all resource development. So there's a fundamental hypocrisy here. The BC NDP is talking about all these big projects. Well, these are fossil fuel projects. Weren't they just a few short years ago suing the government of Alberta and, you know, laying themselves down in front of trucks to stop pipelines? So here's a glimpse into the kind of way in which the lower court's decision on mineral claims has upset the apple cart and has potentially incredible long-reaching and far-reaching implications for BC and the country. So when a person obtains a license to locate a mineral claim, they're called a free miner. The staking system used to be a physical staking system. You had to demarcate the boundaries of your claim by physical posts and claim tags, and I've done that many times myself. However, in around 2004-05, the system was brought online, and the location of a mineral claim can now be done through basically the click of a button. So the question arises, what possible harm could come to a First Nation from the location of a mineral claim? Well, here's how things went in the Gitxaala versus British Columbia case. One of the harms that they proposed, and they put forth evidence from a location of a mineral claim, was what they called spiritual harms. What is a spiritual harm? Well, to get into it, the judge's ruling that anyone can read included a description of the affidavit evidence that was tendered in court regarding the ancient spiritual beliefs of the people involved. And for example, the case deals a lot with Banks Island. So Banks Island is this windswept flat island south of Prince Rupert that they asserted was a den. There could be a den for what they called Nax Nox. What are Nax Nox? Nax Nox were believed to be supernatural beings that dwelled in certain locations up and down the coast. Well, here's the thing. The location of those Nax Nox was said to be secret. So in other words, there might be Nax Nox on the island, but no one is allowed to know where exactly. So the judge found and decided that this potential possible existence of Nax Nox on the island was in fact could give rise to a spiritual harm from the location of a mineral claim. Now, to try to explain how the public should understand these harms, the judge said some incredible things in his ruling that really should have been appealed. And I'll just read one section of it. So he's trying to Well, I'll just read it, and you can take from it what you will. He said in the ruling, "I'm aware that few readers of these reasons outside the members of the Ahatasat and Gitxaala will have an appreciation for Gitxaala's spiritual beliefs. For the context of this discussion, I'm attempting to consider these submissions with a cultural and spiritual context that a wider group may appreciate." So you are the wider group. So he goes on, "For example, I transpose the petitioner's position onto the position that might be taken by groups within the Catholic faith if a mineral claim were granted at the sanctuary of Our Lady of Lourdes in France, or by groups within the Jewish faith if the same were granted at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. On a more local level, what position would be taken if a mineral claim was granted in a cemetery? In my opinion, these examples assist in placing the petitioner's positions in context." So let that sink in. The judge has ruled in a precedent-setting case that the unknowable location of Nax Nox in an unknowable place is the equivalent of the holiest place in all of Judaism, and a physical built structure that dates back to the time of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Our Lady of Lourdes, where it's believed that the apparitions of the Virgin Mother were seen, and is the site of millions of tourists every year, and is highly valued by the world's 1.4 billion Catholics. These built structures are the same as the unknowable location of dens of Nax Nox, that it is not proven that anyone within the community actually believes are real. Now, I don't doubt that some do believe they are real, but census data shows that 47% of Indigenous people in Canada identify as Christian believers. Only 4 or 5% of Indigenous people in Canada say they have Indigenous spirituality. So if those numbers are to be kind of used as a gauge, you're talking 1 in 20, maybe 2 in 20 of the people in that particular nation who actually believe that Nax Nox are these supernatural entities that control and guide people as they travel and traverse up and down the coast. So the judge in this case has clearly entered into fallacy territory. This is a logical fallacy. It's a false equivalence. So because of this false equivalence, which was not appealed by the BCNDP, we now have a standing decision that indicates that anywhere and everywhere in British Columbia could be protected by the court, and any development of any kind, mineral, real estate, the building of oil infrastructure as we see behind us here, or ports, or any kind of development, anything that affects the land. So what the judge has done is connected a sort of ineffable, undefinable spiritual dimension to all of the land in British Columbia. So you can see how this could potentially upend the entire economy of BC. So the question is, why? Why wouldn't the NDP appeal this and make a big deal of it and oppose of it rigorously? Well, it's because they believe it. And I'll explain in a minute this kind of woke approach to public affairs and how wokeism has really upended our political system, and we're not really dealing with a battle between the unwoke and the woke mindset. But before I get into that, I'd like to just talk a bit about the Banks Island situation. So on Banks Island, there was a mine developed. It's a small underground gold mine of around 200 ton a day operation that ran into some problems. It was known in the industry as a bit of a gong show. There was a tailings spill, but keep in mind, it's a very small operation. It wasn't like this Mount Poly-sized open pit. It's a tiny little operation. But the court case omitted the mineral claims that underlie that operation. But even though they had omitted them, they used the evidence of the gong show to bolster their case. And the judge said, well, I'm not going to, the court case doesn't pertain to those claims, so I'm not going to entertain that or consider it as admissible in court. But then he kind of changed his mind and said in the rulings, well, I'll accept it as admissible as general background for my decision. So why wouldn't the West Coast environmental law people, and let's not mistake them for people who are stupid. These people are incredibly intelligent, and they're moving the chess pieces and running circles around their opponents. If they included the claims that underlie the Yellow Giant mine, they would have to admit that they were consulted on that, they approved it, and they were involved in it. They had monitors on site. So how is it that the development of mine that they already knew about and consented to, they can now suddenly oppose? So they chose claims that I would describe as moose pasture, and they used that for their case. So where does that leave us now in this province? Now, I talked about wokeism and how that factors into it. Wokeism is not just simply social policy or social issues. It is a religious issue. The woke mindset and the woke religious philosophy combines two key religious streams. One is the social gospel, which was a liberal Christian tradition that arose around the turn of the last century, where they kind of stirred in Marxist thinking into the gospel of Christ, who a lot of the time rail against rich people and talked about the poor. The meek shall inherit the earth, and blessed are the poor. Well, they thought, well, that kind of resonates a little bit with Marxism and the rising up of the proletariat. So they set out to say, well, let's not have pie in the sky when you die with these evangelical Christian beliefs. We don't believe in miracles. We don't necessarily even believe in God. But we want to bring about social change and bring about social justice. People like J.S. Wordsworth and Tommy Douglas, both founders of what is now the NDP, were social gospelers who thought, let's do good and bring about good. So this do-gooder philosophy has now been mixed in with New Age religion. Well, what is that? New Age religion is an admixture of a kind of a global religious, all religions, all roads lead to Rome. It is multi-faith. But it emphasizes things like shamanism, animism, this idea that, and pantheism, this idea that there's an energy that flows into and out of everything. There's a Mother Earth. There is, all you have to do is travel up Georgia Strait to Cortez Island. There's a New Age Mecca there called Hollyhock. And there you can just go to their website and sign up for what's effectively shamanism training, where you can communicate with entities in the spirit world to help you on your journey of life. There's all kinds of other social activism. Years ago, someone named Vivian Krause wrote a series of articles in the National Post that kind of blew the lid off what she called the Hollyhock Mafia, who had created Mayor Gregor Robertson from whole cloth. And they had a 500-year plan. And it is no coincidence that the founder, one of the key founders of Hollyhock, was the head of Tides Canada, a funder of activism and a kind of establishing the roots of the social justice movement, which is now the embodied with the BCNDP. So you can see how all these threads fit together. The idea that we have sort of an avatar-like envisioning of the world, where the planet is alive. It is animated by a Mother Earth, a deity. This Gaia concept that the Earth is sacred, and then the Indigenous people are portrayed as these spirit beings who are connected and who connect to the Earth. And this is what we should all aspire to. This is all a false equivalence. And at this point, I might explain to you a bit about my background and why it is that, why does David Brett think he, put himself forward as an expert? Well, I have a degree in religious studies from UBC, and it's not a theology degree. It is the study of world religion. So I have an appreciation for myth and for diverse religious experiences, and I have studied world religions. I'm also in the mining industry, and I've grown up in this here in Vancouver, but spent much of my life in the north, in the bush in Vancouver Island, in the Cassio area, in the Tutagon, in the southern Caribou, and in the Yukon, spending sometimes months at a time bushwhacking and experiencing this province. And as an executive, I've worked with Indigenous people. I've negotiated agreements, benefit sharing agreements with Indigenous people. I've been on the land with Chief and Council. I've been in the band offices. And one thing that I've never experienced is Indigenous people saying, we don't want mining. We don't want anything. We want all of the resources to remain in the ground. We're opposed to all of this. That's not the position that I've heard. The position I've heard is that we just want to participate in the prosperity of resource extraction and the mining industry, and I think all extractive industries are fully on board with that. So what is happening now is that the activist phalanx has upended all of that. They have basically, if you think of it like a chess game, we've been checkmated because of this ruling, because of what this judge said, because the NDP's failure to appeal this decision. Now we have the appeal proceeded, and now we have calls to repeal DRIPA. And the NDP people are saying, oh no, we can't do that. Well, if they're so in favor of the instantiation of DRIPA into the laws, why were they opposing it in court in the appeal against West Coast environmental law? Well, because they're not really against it. That's my point. You have, they're like shadow boxing. They're fighting each other. They're on the same team. It's like they're passing the puck to the opposing team, and no one seems to understand. They're throwing the game, as it were. They're throwing the fight. And here we are in BC in this crisis, and that's the key. to understand. And maybe in closing, I'll say this. People who are NDP might be listening to me saying, hey, what are you talking about? The vote to instantiate DRIPA was unanimously supported by both sides of the House. So why are you blaming the NDP? Well, a couple of thoughts there. One is the timing. DRIPA was voted in 2019, and the Kamloops Graves decision, or announcement of mass graves and this giant paroxysms of guilt about this alleged genocidal country called Canada, where these completely unproven assertion of a mass grave did not occur till 2021. And the Gitxaala case was not filed until October of 2021, well after that announcement. The flags were at half-mast, churches were burned. So the context of these court decisions is, when judges look at the contestants in court, they assess their credibility. Imagine you have, in this corner, the victims of a genocide, and in this corner, the perpetrators of that genocide. The whole thing is skewed. So you have, on top of that, you have a government that is sort of compromised by its association with activist lawyers. I mean, the government actually funds a lot of the activism themselves. So what can we do about this? So what I would say is that we have somewhat the breaking down of the traditional dichotomy in the political landscape. I'm just talking about BC, but let's face it. The entire Western world is facing this upending of the Western philosophy, the idea that an unknown, ineffable essence of something might be in the land somewhere, sort of deifying the earth, is equivalent to the Wailing Wall or the faith of 1.4 billion Catholics. Let's face it, the Western society rests on the supposition of the supremacy of God. It's in our Constitution. Many of our laws flow out of the Judeo-Christian heritage that comes from Europe. Well, isn't that where the genocide came from? The genocidal impulse came from Europe and asserted itself on indigenous people, and therefore we should throw that off. And this gets into the whole decolonial juggernaut that we find ourselves in, where there's a move to decolonize everything. Well, the courts are doing it. The way to decolonize things is to declare the world sacred and the other religions of the world that have founded Western society to be impinging upon that land. Pull the land. If you can upset access to the land, you upset access to everything. So perhaps what will emerge from this crisis is that we'll see a slightly different sort of partitioning of political forces. The woke versus the unwoke. It is not fair to say that everyone who voted NDP is woke. Everyone who works for a union, everyone who drives a truck, who's a member of the Teamsters, or who is a steel worker, is somehow signing up for the idea that we should, consider the holy sites in the Holy Land as equivalent. So, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention one thing, and I'll add it here. Further proof that the NDP is pursuing this religious evangelical, if you will, game is their attempt to rejig the Heritage Conservation Act. They came up with what they call the Heritage Conservation Act Transformation Project. So what is that all about? Oh, well, it just happens to be, it was started in 2022, before this judgment came down. They want to do exactly what this judge is saying. They want the quote-unquote spiritual, intangible cultural heritage to apply when an archaeological dig takes place. So, for example, behind me is the site of the Cowichan, where the court found there was a Cowichan village, and by all accounts there was. So an archaeological dig would normally look for tangible things, footings of buildings, artifacts, middens, physical things. These are what archaeologists look for. So what EB and the NDP are attempting to do is completely misunderstand what intangible cultural heritage is by asserting that these spiritual stories and ideas of Indigenous people are tantamount to archaeological evidence. So someone says there's a Nax Nox in a den somewhere in Richmond. Well, that affects all land use planning in Richmond. So the pushback on that was so hard that it's been shelved. But I bring it up because it just goes to show that there is a worldview, a clash of worldviews happening here. And just to talk a little bit about intangible cultural heritage here, I think it's very important that people recognize that the United Nations, through UNESCO in 2003, created what they called the 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. And I personally believe that's incredibly important for Indigenous people. And Canada should sign it. They have not been a signatory, but because think about it. What they call ICH could involve Indigenous dance, carving, not the carvings, but the art of carving and the way that is passed down. This oral passing down of intangible cultural heritage is incredibly important for Indigenous people. Clothing, language. The speaking of the language is intangible cultural heritage. But what is not intangible cultural heritage is the positing of religious and supernatural entities and sacred mystical, vague, nebulous things in the environment and connected to the land. That's not intangible cultural heritage, but they're trying to push that idea to sort of tie in knots the entire economy of the province, to upset it. So hopefully my initial thesis is coming clear here. The BC NDP has been working with activists. And finally, I'll say this. Well, what about the other side of the House? Why did they vote for this? There is no question that the right-left dichotomy, when it comes to woke, is not equal. There are woke people on both sides, and unfortunately, it's just simply a failure of the media and politicians on both sides to recognize what's really going on and the kind of radical change that is attempted to be put in place. So maybe what will come out of this is you'll have the woke party and the unwoke party. That will be the dividing line. And that probably won't happen, but what really should happen is these concepts of wokeness, as opposed to defending Western values. It is not woke to defend Western values. So shouldn't we? Shouldn't we be proud of the fact that this area that the Cowichan have laid a claim to is worth so much money? Why is it worth so much money? It's not because there's still a village here for seasonal salmon fishing. It's because of all the industry and all of the economic activity that have been built up through the Western tradition of economic development. It's now worth a lot. Private property is worth a lot. And sorry, I keep saying finally, but this is my final point. We have to distinguish between constitutional law and DRIPA. They're not the same thing, but they're bleeding together. The spiritual harms argument and this idea of sanctifying and spiritualizing all land development in the province flows out, supposedly, from constitutional law. The duty to consult on mineral claims. This ruling of the judge has thrown the mining industry into a complete mess. The idea that you should have to consult with First Nations for the location of a mineral claim undermines the entire idea. Sorry, one last point. Another bizarre aspect of the judge's ruling is he didn't consider at all what are called placer mineral claims. What is placer? Placer is what people normally associate with gold mining. It's gold panning, sluice boxes, and finding gold nuggets. That's what the Americans, and that's what all of the gold rush in BC and in the Cariboo was all about. It wasn't about hard rock mining, about mining mineral deposits underneath the ground. A mineral tender grants you rights to the subsurface minerals. It can be argued that placer mining involves much more surface disturbance. It's orders of magnitude more surface disturbance if you have a placer mine than if you're just doing exploration, which is drilling holes, and eventually 1 in 1,000 or 2,000 exploration projects might develop into a mine. But if you're digging around with a D8 cat and excavators and moving dirt and moving massive amounts of gravel and alluvial material, there's massive amounts of surface. So the judge said in his decision, we're not even going to consider placer claims. They're set aside. They're not, we don't want to bother ourselves with those claims. Well, that's what the Mining Act of 1859 was based on. It was based on placer. So the decision is so flawed, it just boggles the mind. And our NDP overlords decided, well, we're not going to appeal that because we kind of like it. We kind of like the decision. Yes, let's set up a framework for all these evil corporate miners to go out there and make it hard for them. Let's make it difficult for them. Because ultimately our goal is to transfer all of those resources to the state. This is the socialist nirvana. So with that, I will leave you. I thank you for watching. My name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. If you like what we're doing at the New Westminster Times, I invite you to support our work. You can go to newwesttimes.com. Up in the right-hand corner, there's a button that says Support Our Work. If you would be so inclined, we would really appreciate it. We do have costs, and any kind of support, encouragement from the public is much appreciated. So thank you very much for listening today.